now at the point in the service where if you're sort of 11 or under, we're going to let you go out to your activities and programs. So if kids want to head out, I think it's preschool on this side and elementary on that side. And then while that's happening, why don't we just take another minute, just say hello to somebody. Is youth staying in or? Yeah, okay. So if you're a middle school or high school student, you're going to stay in. Any particular instructions here, Brian, for heading out, just out through the door? Great. Okay. So let me just move this. As I was saying, obviously, it's Palm Sunday today, and we've also been celebrating Community Sunday together. We're also, it's the last day of our series, Heart Cries from the Cross, where we've been looking at sayings from Jesus from the cross. And because it's Easter next week, we're going to try and touch on the 6th and 7th heart cry today. So we've got a lot to do, not a lot of time to do it in. So I'm going to give it my best shot here. But I think Palm Sunday it's an unusual celebration in some respects because it's quite triumphant, quite joyful. We were waving palms when Kevin read the story to us. It's sometimes called the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, but it comes on the back of Lent, right? We've been celebrating Lent, if you can call it a celebration. It's a very reflective, pensive time, a time where we think about how we need to change. Maybe we think about some of the darker sides of our lives. Certainly, we begin Lent with Ash Wednesday, which is quite a dark moment in many respects. I mean, not unhealthy, but it's sober and at times somber. And then Sunday we come to Palms, think about what we've been doing for the last few weeks as well, looking at the crucifixion and heart cries from the cross and the anguish of Jesus on the cross. So to then come to Palm Sunday and start celebrating can feel a bit like a roller coaster. And then we also know that Good Friday's coming, death is coming, and it's going to get worse. But also we know it's going to get much better because Jesus is going to come back to life and we'll celebrate resurrection. But then we're also left with, you think what happened to the followers of Jesus after the resurrection, think about our lives. It's not like we're not always living a triumphant kind of life. It's not like the resurrection necessarily just made everything easy or made everything plain sailing. So, there's this sort of up and down of the life of Jesus and the up and down of our own experience of life, the human experience. And Palm Sunday, I think, is one of these sort of almost like an anomaly in the middle of all that. Now, Jesus enters Jerusalem really proclaimed as a messianic king. In that story and in some of the songs we've sung this morning, we hear the word Hosanna, which means save us. The crowds were looking to Jesus to save them. Hosanna to the Son of David. The Messiah, that's a messianic reference. The Messiah was expected to be a descendant of David. David, the king, was king at a time when Israel was prosperous and powerful, pretty much as prosperous and powerful as it ever had been. So it's looking back really and referencing the golden era, if you like, of Israelite history, of Jewish history, and it's in stark contrast to the situation they were in at that particular time where they're occupied by the Romans. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. That's a quote from Psalm 118, which is a psalm, a processional psalm that they would often sing on the way to Jerusalem. It's a celebration of victory in battle in many respects, that psalm. And of course, they wave palms. We've all got, well, most of us, I think, have palms. Interestingly, you wouldn't have heard in Matthew's Gospel, which was the version we read, they just talk about the Gospel actually specifically calls them palms. And there's some evidence, it's not conclusive by any means, but some evidence that's to suggest that actually palms, the symbol of the palm, had become a symbol of resistance to Rome in that time. It was a symbol of the rebellion against Rome, the revolt against Rome. We don't know that for sure, but that may be why some of them were waving palms. There may have been this expectation that Jesus was going to bring some kind of political liberation. Certainly it's the Passover Jerusalem. And this is Jesus. So it's ironic. This messianic king has been welcomed, but Jesus comes as a lowly servant, riding on a donkey, fulfilling actually what the ancient prophets always said the messianic figure would be like, and perhaps answering the longing in our hearts for peace, for communion, for unity, for love to exist in a way that we perhaps never experienced before. There's a longing for that in the human heart, but we tend to resort to fear and hatred and violence, and that's how we manage life. That's how we manage populations. That's how we manage our relationships. That's how we manage ourselves. Jesus, on the other hand, is bringing a completely different way. So when they say, Hosanna, save us, perhaps they don't quite understand what they're saying. Perhaps, ironically, they're being prophetic about we need salvation, we need to be saved, but it's love that's going to save us. Only love can ultimately save humanity. And that's the work of Jesus. That's the work that Jesus has come to do, to show us the way, to love us to the end, to love completely, even to death, to love sacrificially. Jesus has that work to do. Jesus is carrying out that work. And so as we fast forward to the cross, we see an equivalent amount of irony, I think, of the cross. We don't normally sort of talk about the cross as irony because it almost seems disrespectful when we think of how awful it was. But really, when we look at the cross, what it looks like is the triumph of power and violence and hatred and control over love. It looks like if you love, you'll get crushed. If you are non-violent, you'll get crushed. If you're forgiving, you will get crushed. That's what the cross looks like. But the irony is that something completely different is going on. Love is triumphing. Love is triumphing on the cross. Jesus is showing that it's possible to love even in the most horrendous circumstances, even out the worst, foulest, most dark scenario. Love can bring forth life. Love can bring forth light. It's possible. And as you've probably heard me say many times before, I think it's that reality, that creative reality, that's perhaps the most creative force in the universe that brings Jesus back to life. That is the source of the resurrection. I can't prove that, but that's what I think. And I was saying the other day, most of us, including me, are making a lot of things up, right? Because we're trying to find our way in the dark. We're trying to find our way forward. But that's my sense of what's going on there. Anyway, now that brings us to the saying. So the sixth saying of Jesus on the cross comes from John's Gospel. It's the third saying in John, what we call the sixth one in terms of the order they traditionally go with, and it's where Jesus says, "It is finished." And I'm not going to say too much about this because I thought Ruth did a really great job of that section last week where she was talking about I thirst, and it's sort of connected to that "it is finished" saying. But it says that Jesus said it is finished, and then he breathed his last. He expired. He died. And we're going to look at some of that language in a moment in the various Gospels for that moment of death of Jesus, the very moment when Jesus expires, if you like. So what is it that Jesus has finished? Well, again, Ruth said last week, it's the work of Jesus, the work that he's been given to do, which is love, is complete. He's loved to the very end, even to death. It's finished. That task that he had been given, that he had taken on, was over. If we look at earlier in John's Gospel, as we sort of head into the last few days of Jesus' life, he alludes to this. He says, "I've brought you glory on earth." He's praying at this point. "I've brought you glory on earth by finishing the work you gave me to do." So he has this deep sense that something's being completed here. Earlier in John, when he gathers his disciples to celebrate the Last Supper, the Passover meal, it says in chapter 13, maybe we can look at that. It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. He loved them to the end. And that expression to the end, it means he loved them to the ultimate, to the most possible. It means it has a sort of infinite, eternal aspect to it in the original language. In other words, Jesus has drunk the whole cup, as we've been looking at over the past few weeks. He's completed this mission. He's loved as much as you could possibly love. He's completing something here. And then in chapter, I think when we look at the next section, in chapter 15, of course, having completed this work, I mean, these aren't in chronological order the way John records them, but Jesus is saying to his followers, okay, this is now your work. As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Now remain in my love. If you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I've kept my Father's commands and remain in his love. I've told you this so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. That word complete, that it may be full, eternal, real. My command is this: love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command. I no longer call you servants, because a servant does not know his master's business. Instead, I've called you friends. For everything that I learned from my Father, I've made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you so that you might go and bear fruit that will last. It's eternal fruit, something so profound. And so that whatever you ask in my name, the Father will give you. This is my command: love each other. So Jesus is giving us this task, giving us this work, but he's done something incredible to make it doable. He's finished something to make it possible. He's shown us the way. And Jesus would later say, and I think he's inferring it here about remain in my love, that and my love will remain in you, that actually the presence of Christ, the presence of the risen Christ is somehow empowering us to live this way even now, even as we live and breathe right now in this very moment. So the work is complete. Now, let's go on to the seventh saying, which comes in Luke's gospel. And this is the saying, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit, or some versions say, into your hands I commend my spirit. It comes from the Gospel of Luke. It's one of three sayings in Luke. It only appears in Luke. And we'll look at this section now in chapter 23. It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon, for the sun stopped shining. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Jesus called out with a loud voice, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. When he had said this, he breathed his last. The centurion, seeing what had happened, praised God and said, surely this was a righteous man. When all the people who had gathered to witness this sight saw what took place, they beat their breasts and went away. But all those who knew him, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance watching these things. So here's Jesus, literally before he breathes his last, he says, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And there's something very beautiful and tender about this. In the middle of the agony of the cross, the agony of execution, the agony of the injustice, there's this sense of Jesus somehow being at peace. And he quotes a psalm. This is a quote from Psalm, maybe we can put this one up actually. It's a quote from Psalm 31. I'll just read the first 5 verses. It's a psalm of David. In you, Lord, I have taken refuge. Let me never be put to shame. Deliver me in your righteousness. Turn your ear to me. Come quickly to my rescue. Be my rock of refuge, a strong fortress to save me. Since you are my rock and my fortress, for the sake of your name, lead and guide me. Keep me free from the trap that is set for me, for you are my refuge. Into your hands I commit my spirit. Deliver me, Lord, my faithful God. So you can see the quote there that Jesus makes. And this is a psalm all about deliverance from difficulty, deliverance from danger. And there's this sense of, in all of that, in the trauma of life, committing ourselves and resting in God's presence and being one with God. Our spirit just being released to be at peace with God in a state of oneness. You can see how that psalm might have come to mind to Jesus, and Jesus quotes that line. Jesus' sayings on the cross are quite brief. In in the ones we had last week, for instance, Ruth mentioned this, dipso, is just, I thirst, is just one word in the Greek. Of course, Jesus is speaking Aramaic when he's saying these words, but it's very brief. When he says it is finished in John's Gospel, it's just one word, tetelestai, in the Greek. Again, I'm not sure what that would be in the Aramaic, but it's very brief. You get this sense of Jesus coming to the end, and he can barely talk. He's got just breath. He sort of breathes out words, breathes out sayings, because he's so close to the end. And he just quotes one line from this psalm, as he did when he said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He quotes one line from the psalm. He quotes another one here, but he modifies it slightly, because he says, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." And Jesus may have quoted this verse in Hebrew, because that's what the original language it was written in, or he may have said the whole verse in his native tongue, Aramaic. But certainly when he adds the word father, a tender term, he would most likely have used the Aramaic term, Abba, which is this very tender, personal expression to a parent. And Jesus is using that kind of language. It reminds us, as we've talked about before at this point, where Jesus is giving his spirit over. It reminds us to the beginning of the Jesus story, where the Spirit descends on Jesus at his baptism. We talked about this a few weeks ago when we were looking actually at Mark's Gospel, how Mark kind of bookends the story of Jesus with the baptism and the crucifixion. In the baptism, the Spirit descends, and it's like, "Here is my beloved Son." There's a voice from heaven, or people hear a voice, or Jesus hears a voice. We're not sure. It's different. The different Gospels phrase that differently. But there's this sense of oneness with the Father as Jesus kind of breathes in the Spirit. That word pneuma, the Spirit, is also the same word for breath. Jesus breathes in the Spirit, and it's like it's full of the Spirit, and then lives the Spirit-filled life, lives this life of love, and then on the cross hands over his Spirit back to the Father. And the language there is I think really important. We're going to sort of compare the different Gospels here about how Jesus breathes in, but then breathes out the Spirit. This word that we've used, that the author of Luke uses for commend my spirit, is paratethemai. It means to lay down, or to deposit, or to entrust. It can also mean to plant. So to as in agriculturally. So and I love that expression, or that connotation, because there's something alive about it. Right here is Jesus dying, and he's saying, "I plant my Spirit in you, Father." And the inference of planting something is that something's going to come alive, right? Something's going to be created. Something's going to be fruitful. And so this isn't the end. This isn't the end. This is perhaps just the beginning. And as Luke talks about, the author talks about Jesus handing over his Spirit, all the Gospels have that sense of being handed over. As I said, Matthew and Mark don't actually include a final saying just before Jesus dies. John and Luke do. But they say this, let's look at Mark's Gospel. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. So there's a cry there in Matthew's Gospel, which is probably working off Mark. And when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. So you can see there's some similar language there, and there's this sense, maybe that loud cry was a saying. Maybe Jesus at that point said, "It is finished." Maybe Jesus is quoting the psalm, and not everybody could hear it. So the eyewitnesses that told the story that ends up in Matthew is slightly different to the one that in Mark, and different to the one in Luke. Who knows? But there's some similarities to this moment where Jesus dies. And I want to I put a slide together that kind of illustrates this. And we're going to look at some of the original language, just very briefly. The original language in one sense isn't that important, but when we realize what's happening here in the original language, I think it gives us some interesting insight. So in John, we're going to go back, we normally go Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, don't we? We're going to go John, Luke, Mark, Matthew. In John's Gospel, it just says in the English, in the New International Version, he gave up his spirit. This is the moment when Jesus dies. That word paradidomai in the Greek, paradidomai pneuma, so he gives up his spirit. The word paradidomai has, it's like releasing, allowing. It has that sense of letting go, of surrender. similar to how Luke describes it with that saying of Jesus. This is not a saying of Jesus. This is just the narrator saying what happens. Jesus gave up his spirit. In Luke, it simply says, after the saying of Jesus, into your hands, Father, I commend my spirit, it just says one word, Jesus ekneo. In other words, Jesus breathed out. It's there that you can see that, ekneo is related to the word pneuma, again, breath or spirit. So Jesus expires, literally. He just breathes out his last. And it's translated as he breathed his last. So breathed his last and gave up his spirit. In Mark, it's breathed his last. It's that word ekneo again. So you get the connection here for the ancients of the connection of breath and spirit, which we talked about quite a bit, even during this series. And then in Matthew, it's translated in the English, in the New International Version, he gave up his spirit, so a little bit like John. But there's a different word used there. And it's this word aphiemi, pneuma. And that word aphiemi is really interesting because only Matthew uses it. And it means to release, it means to let go, to give up. Not in the sense of, oh, that's it, I'm done now, but to surrender, especially to let go, to yield. And it's interesting how the author of Matthew uses that word elsewhere. We're just going to run through a few things here, a few examples. At once they left, aphiemi, at once they left their nets and followed him. There's that sense of yielding. The followers of Jesus, this is after Jesus calls his first disciples, they kind of leave their profession, they leave their material welfare, they leave behind hopes and aspirations and dreams, and they're following Jesus. There's this sense of yielding, right, of surrendering, of letting go. Another example of this, several in the Sermon on the Mount. This is one of them, where Jesus says, "Look, if you've got a grudge against somebody, or they've got a grudge against you, if you've got a broken relationship, and you're about to make an offering at the temple, or at the altar of some kind, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First, go and be reconciled to them, and then come and offer your gift." That term "leave" is aphiemi. In other words, it's like let go of religious pretense, let go of hypocrisy. Like if you can't be all spiritual in the temple but actually be out of sorts with people when you haven't actually done what you needed to do to not be out of sorts in real life. There's that sense of a yielded life, a life where we let go of pretense. Later on we can do that. Just go through these real quick. In the Sermon on the Mount, if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. Aphiemi, hand over your coat, yield your coat. In other words, again, yield perhaps their material possessions, attachment to things, maybe attachment to being right. I mean, who of us wants to be perhaps sued and found guilty when we're not guilty? Who of us would actually want to say, "Oh, well, you can have a bit more if you like"? Now, I'm not saying that's always the wisest thing to do. Might depend on the circumstances, but I think the point here is living an unattached life, living a yielded life, a life where we can just let go of things. We don't have to hold on. Another example is in Matthew 6, and perhaps this is the most dramatic one, or a vivid one. "And forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors." So forgiveness, that word "forgive our debts" is aphiemi. In other words, let go of our debts, God. Yield our debts, because we're going to let go of others' debts. We're just going to let go of resentment, of bitterness. We're not going to hold people to some account of perfection. We're just going to let it go. It's a yielded life. And then finally, in Matthew 19, Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them. For the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these." Where's aphiemi there? It's a trick question. It's not one of the examples, though it is. It's let the children come to me. In other words, letting go of power, letting go of privilege, letting go of what we can, the control we can have in order to empower others, to let others be successful, to give other people the credit, not having to push ourselves forward all the time. So here's Jesus expiring. Here's Jesus breathing his last. But here's Jesus actually letting go because Jesus knows that he's one with God. Jesus knows where he's come from and where he's going. Jesus has lived that life of yieldedness, of letting go, because it's in that context that we get to truly love unconditionally. And so maybe the band could come up now, because we're going to close out with a song in a moment. But we're just going to do a brief meditation around this whole concept of letting go, and associated with breath. And we've done this numerous times here before. But there's that sense in which, you know, when we breathe, we let go all the time, right? Because when we breathe in, you can't keep breathing in. You can't keep breathing in. If you want to take another breath, which you need to do, you have to let go of the other one. And it's this symbol, perhaps, of the necessity, this just the normality, it just is. We have to let go. That's life. Life is about letting go. Life is about letting go and letting our lives be planted so that something beautiful and creative can evolve. And there may be things that we find hard to let go of, like we hold on to things like unforgiveness or resentment, and we've all been treated in sometimes appalling ways. It's really hard to let go of those things. Or it could be concern or anxiety about anything. Maybe we're worried about finance, we're worried about safety and security, we're worried about the world, we're worried about our relationships, all sorts of things. And we saw some examples there from Jesus' teaching of what it looks like to live a very practically yielded, let go life. So let's just, maybe we could put the lights down a little bit. We're just going to focus on our breathing. The ancients saw no difference between spirit and breath. It's as though God's presence is actually in our breath. We breathe God in, and we can surrender and go back to the Father. We can say, give our spirits back to the Father. And we all do that. When we were born, we all took one breath in. And one day, we will all breathe our last. We will breathe out again for the last time. And in between those two breaths, we're constantly breathing. So let's just focus on that breathing. Breathe in God's love, God's affirmation, God's presence. And as you breathe out, let go. Let go. Commend your spirit, commit your spirit to the Father. Then breathe in God's love again. And let go. Perhaps consciously let go of what you know you need to let go of. Something that you're holding on to at the moment that's just there. Let's take a few moments just to breathe in, breathe out. As you breathe in God's love, be conscious of God's presence around you, in you. And as you breathe out, just sink deeper into that. As you breathe in, imagine yourself totally, completely loved. And as you breathe out, let go of what just doesn't matter when you're that loved. Abba, Father, into your hands we let go. Amen. I'm going to sing a song to close out today. So band are going to lead us in that. So why don't we all just stand and sing together?
Let go of every single dream. I lay each one down at your feet.